Hey folks, we're ready for part two of the model view controller discussion. So what you saw previously was an idea for this model view controller design pattern. So you have a model which contains some data, you have a view which is allowing users to see that data and potentially manipulate the data graphically or through the keyboard or whatever. And you have this thing called the controller, which is responsible for figuring out, hey, when the user does some kind of manipulation on the screen, whether it's through a web browser or through the keyboard or through an app running locally on a phone or a PC or whatever, um, this is what it means when the user does that thing to the model. When the user clicks on a bar, it means add 1 to the number of grades for that particular bar, as an example. So if we're going to do something like that in our application, and I'm trying to sell this to you as a great idea because what it does is it really cleans up the code in your application. So if we're going to do something like that in our application, the first place that we're going to start is with the login controller. So remember, the login controller, we're going to display a login screen that asks for user ID and password, and then we're going to react to the user interaction with that set of that login form, basically. So I've sort of pre-written a few lines of code to get things started. This is sort of the standard code that you write with any of our Python-based web application code. But now I'm going to start doing a couple things that are a little different. The first thing I'm going to do is create a class, and I'm going to call the class login controller. All right. So I'm going to use this class to do everything that needs to be done to interface between the view, which is going to be a web-based representation of the data store that we have, and the model, which is going to be, well, there's a couple things in the model. So one model is there's a user model, we have users, and then another model is there's a book model, we have books. So for the login controller, it doesn't really care about the books, it cares about the user. So the login controller's job is to act as an interface between the web-based visualization of stuff related to users and the users that are actually stored in our data store someplace, which is going to be managed by the user model. All right, so the first thing we're going to do for this controller is we're going to create a constructor. All right, and so the constructor is going to look like this. DEF, all right, so you're used to that for the names of methods, but now you're going to do 2 underscores and then say init, and then 2 more underscores, and then say self. Now when you do this, you're basically saying, hey, Python, I'm creating a constructor. All right, now the code in this constructor is basically the code that's going to get executed when the view says, hey, login controller, do something for me. And it might say, hey, login controller, do something for me because there's some data that's been filled out in the form. Or it might say, login controller, do something for me because I've never talked to you before. So we had that situation. We had that situation, and that's a very common situation with login. You're either going to log in for the first time, in which case there's really no information, or you're actually trying to log in which case some information's been filled in the form. So the constructor for the login controller is going to figure out both of those things. Is this the first time, or is this a time when the user is actually providing some information to log in? All right, so to do this, this shouldn't look terribly shocking. We're going to grab from the form we're going to get the field storage information, and then we're going to say user ID equals form.getValue user ID, and make this just a little bit bigger for you so you can see it. And password equals form.getValue password. Okay. Now, here's where things get different. Once you have this information, there's a lot of different code, lots of different code that you wrote to do stuff. We're going to greatly simplify this by taking advantage of the fact that we have both a model and a view to work with. So the controller, remember, acts as an interface between the model and the view. And so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to say, hey, controller, we'd like a view. So the view is going to be equal to something called login view. So this is an object that is going to be created when we call the login view constructor. Now you might be saying to yourself, well, what is this login view thing? Where does it come from? What's the magic here? There is no magic. We're going to have to write the code for the login view. But it's really putting all of the code in the login view that deals with the web-based, HTML-based stuff. So all the HTML that you write, all those print statements and stuff like that, that's all going to go in this login view class. And we just grab the object that's going to manage the HTML that gets squirted to the browser. That's the login view object. Now to make that work up here, I'm going to add a from login view import login view. Okay, so we're going to have to write the code to make this work. But we'll worry about that later. We're going to use some procedural abstraction to just blow that off and just say, well, we have this magical thing called a view now. Awesome. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is we have to figure out, is the view supposed to report back an empty login form, or is the view supposed to process the form data that came back when the user clicked submit? That's the job of this controller. What do we do with the login view? All right, so we're going to say this, if self.isValid, so we're going to have to write an isValid method, which you've written in the past, user ID, password. Okay, so if it's valid, that means that the user correctly logged in. All right, and if self.isValid is not valid, it means that the user is coming to this website for the first time or incorrectly logged in, whatever, and it means we need to display an empty form. All right, so how does isValid work? At this moment, I'm not going to worry about that. We're just going to pretend that it magically works, and we'll write some code for it in just a moment. All right, so self.isValid, user ID, password. Okay, so this is the code that I'm going to write for moving on. If we get a valid user, it's time to move on to the next web page, which is the page in BookVoter that lets the user vote for a book. But before we move on, we want to record the user ID information so that the next web page can find out about it. So cookie equals cookies dot simple cookie. Should look familiar. And then cookie sub user ID equals user ID. And now here's where you would have written a lot of print statements to get the HTML out to the browser, to redirect, to get the web page to jump from the login web page stuff to the survey web page stuff. But instead, what we're going to do here is we're going to use the view that we created right here, and we're going to have that view do all the work. We're going to say, view, I would like you to redirect, and here's the user ID information that here's the cookie information that you need when you do the redirect. So often when you have to redirect from one page to another, you're going to be carrying around cookie information. So the redirect method for a view takes a cookie. Now it's not required, but it can be really helpful. All right, well, if this is not the code for validating, if the user isn't valid, which could be we had an invalid user ID password, or we didn't have a user ID password because this is the first time we've hit the login controller, then what we're going to do instead is we're going to have the view display itself, and that's the view method. So all of the print statements that print out the HTML that make the login form appear are encapsulated in the view method. All right, isn't that nice? So this login controller, the glue that connects the view to the model, it is super clean. There's hardly any code here. We just got to get some form information from the form. We create a view. We figure out, all right, is the user ID and password that was passed in valid? If so, we do a redirect, and if not, we redisplay the login form. That's pretty much it for the program. Now, if you think about what the original program looked like for the login.py file, there was lots and lots of code in here. And I'm sure for your email program, you have lots and lots of code. But we've just greatly simplified it. Okay. Next, let's create the isValid method, because that's something else that this controller is responsible for. So the isValid method is a method that figures out if you have a valid user ID and password. So def isValid. And this also should look pretty familiar. So we're going to say self. We always take self as a parameter if we're doing object-oriented methods for Python. User ID, password. And now, okay. Now, if you recall, what isValid did for both book voter and most likely for the email program that you wrote is there's some user file you have somewhere, some user data store. And you go into that user data store and you search it and you look to make sure that the user ID and password that were passed in match something that's in the file. So there's a lot of code that goes in isValid here. But we're not going to do that. We're actually going to greatly simplify this by introducing another kind of design pattern, and that's called the Data Access Object Design Pattern, or the DAO design pattern. Now, I don't want to describe it in detail just yet, but I just want to show you the power of it, how useful it is in creating procedural abstraction to make your code a lot simpler. And then we'll go into it in depth in just a little bit. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to say DAO, the data access object, is equal to user DAO. All right, so now we have this thing, another object that's an object just like view is an object, and just like actually the login controller is an object, another object, and the goal of this object is to make it easy for a programmer to access and manipulate a data store that contains users. So I'm going to say user is equal to DAO dot select by user ID. Whoa, this is a pretty nice method. So apparently this DAO object has a method called select by user ID, and if you pass in the user ID to that method, then the DAO will search the data store, which in our case is a file, text file that contains users. It'll search that file for the user that matches that user ID, and it will return that user, but not just the user ID. It'll return all the information about the user. In our case, it's just the user ID and password, but in a more complicated system, it could be lots of different information about a user. So that's awesome. Now, just like the login view, class, we're going to have to write the code to make the user DAO data access object. We're going to have to write the code to make that work. But at this point, we can just pretend it's magic and it works. If we say DAO.select by user ID and pass in a user ID, user will get the user that matches that user ID in the data store, in the users.txt file. How does it do it? At this point, we don't care. It just does it. It's magic. Okay. So what I want to do after I've collected that user is I want to return a Boolean. And the Boolean consists of two separate expressions. The first expression is I want to make sure that user is not none. Now, why would the user be none? Take a moment to think about that. Why or how? So, yeah. Why would the user be none? Well, I'm biting my tongue because I want you to think about it for a second. I'm biting my tongue and I'm waiting for you to figure this out. Alright. I think I've given you enough time. Alright, I've given you enough time, and if you don't feel like you have enough time and you want to think about it for a second, just hit pause. Alright, here's the beans being spilled. If DAO.select by user ID gets a user ID which is null, and that can happen because this is the first time you're visiting the form, and so there isn't a user ID that's extracted from the form. When we try to use form.getValue up here, we don't get a user ID because it's the first time you're visiting the page. Or the user ID is bogus. You know, you put in Slarty Bardfast for user ID, but the database, the data store only has Ralph, Shai, Bob, and Tim in it. Well, then this DAO.select by user ID with the user ID of none being passed in or an invalid user ID being passed in is going to return none. So we want to make sure the user ID is not the user is not none, and we also want to make sure that the user.password is equal to the password. Now wait a second here. This is kind of interesting too. This statement here of user.password, that indicates that this user thing that is returned by select by user ID, that user is an object. How cool is that? And the object has at least one member, and that's the password member. It actually has another member, the user ID member. So it has two different members, user ID and password. So that's really cool. So let's look at this DAO again. This thing is pretty awesome. DAO.select by user ID, you pass in a user ID, it returns a user object. If the user object is none, it didn't find the user in the database or in the data store, or the user you passed in, the user ID you passed in was none, and so it was bogus. So either way, the user will be set to none. If it does find the user ID in the data store, then user will be set to the information that is stored in the data store about the user. And in our case, that information is the user ID and the password. So there's a user.userid field member, and there's a user.password member. And in this return statement, we can check user.password against the password that we extracted from the form. And if those two match, then we've got a good user. So this return statement is then saying if user is not none and user.password equals password, then we're going to return true. That is a valid user. We found the user in the data store, and the password of the user matched the password that was typed in the form. And if those two things happen, then self is valid, returns true, and we know it's time to move on to a redirect. We're going to let the user log in, and we're going to redirect to the survey page. Incredibly, this is all the code that you have to write to get the controller for the login page to work. Now, there's one more line, and that goes right here. And this line is the main program. And what the main program does is it says controller equals login controller. So when you type logincontroller.py in the web browser, it's going to execute the main program. The main program is going to create an instance of login controller, triggering the constructor, which is right here. And that constructor is going to pull the data from the form, create a view, check to see if we have a valid user ID and password. If we do, we're going to store that user ID in the cookie and redirect to the survey page. And if we don't have a valid user ID and password, we're going to display the login form by calling view.view. So that is a description of the login controller. All right, the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to talk about the login view.